Why don't we start with quick introductions? Maria?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Brian, for having us here. My name is Maria. I'm part of PwC's privacy and cybersecurity practice. So I'm bringing a slightly different lens to all of you here on the data protection consumer side. I've been with our firm for the last 4 years, focusing on privacy, anything from regulatory assessments to audits and third-party assurance. And prior to that, I was at Nimity, which is a privacy research firm specializing on privacy compliance alerts for our clients. So I bring a slightly non-as technical lens, and I'm hoping to provide that to you today.
Hello, everyone. I'm Abhijayendra Singh. I work for Deloitte Cyber Risk Practices. I've been doing cloud security for the last 6 years, and specifically been in the security industry for the last 15 years. I bring most of the technical expertise, so I've been primarily involved in heavy, deep platform-related security and integrations stuff.
My name is Amin. I'm from Ernst & Young, or EY. I've been working with cloud, hands-on, practical cloud since 2006. So when AWS first came out of beta, I was a CTO of a company where we basically put our entire, it was a startup company, put the entire infrastructure, production, test, developers, I put them all in the cloud. AWS, chief evangelist flew down and did kind of a little sweetheart story about the company. We raised $5 million in VC. And then I decided to go and join PwC and did some work in cyber and continued to work in cloud. In about 2012, I decided to leave PwC. I got the startup bug again and decided to go do another startup company. So we raised $1 million in VC, and the entire platform was built on Azure. And so, kind of continued through that consulting journey with doing cybersecurity, written many courses in cloud security for companies like Learning Tree International, published, a number of opinions and papers. And now, recently I lead cloud security for Ernst & Young.
Hey guys, my name is Arani. I'm a manager with a cybersecurity practice at KPMG. So my focus is on cyber strategy, governance, and cyber defense controls. And within those service lines, some of the technical areas that I focus on is primarily secure DevOps and cloud security. So, on a day-to-day basis, we advise clients on how to securely adopt cloud, while different agile manner and different security controls that goes into it. Really proponent of the fact of putting design at a controls at like a design level itself and moving to cloud in a secure manner.
Fantastic. So lots of different expertise, which is great. So I'll ask the naive question again. How do I start thinking about this? How do I think about the cloud different than what I've been doing on premise? How do I even start the conversation? Go ahead.
I'll really start with that. So I think thinking about cloud is first to get your business requirements in. Like what is the need for going to cloud? Is it mostly a cost saving measure that you're kind of put in place? Is it most of the some of the clients actually have caught on to the trend of moving to the cloud. Every other competitors are moving to the cloud, so they want to explore what moving to the cloud exactly means. So I think defining the business requirements, understanding moving to a cloud is not really kind of shifting data centers. You're not going from a traditional data center to another data center. It really depends on what kind of a model you're going in. So depending on if you're going to a SaaS service, depending on if you're going to a infrastructure as a service, it really means different levels of responsibilities, different levels of controls. If you are a regulated company, if your business has certain regulations that you have to abide by, that also changes the discussion. So it really starts with understanding what the exact need is, what are the real purpose of moving to the cloud, and starting your discussions through that, because that's going to drive a lot of those other factors, which is probably going to increase your spend as well as you go.
So from our perspective, totally agree with Arani on a lot of the cool kids are all moving to the cloud. Gartner just released a study on cloud. They're expecting almost 10%, 8.7% compound growth year over year until 2023. So the reality is, whether you like it or not, your organization is either already in the cloud or is moving to the cloud. The key that we start to help, or in terms of, back to your question about like, where do I start and how should I start? It's recognizing that you're either there or you're going there. In order to do it well, you need to stop, slow down, and be purposeful about the cloud. So a lot of organizations that we're working with right now, we get brought in, we're doing security assessments, and one of the first things we talk to them about is, why are you going to the cloud? What are the key drivers? And often it's going to be, well, my CIO says it's operations and reduce cost. Others want to say we want to take advantage of new technologies that are potentially, performant in the cloud, and so that's the reason why. Regardless of what the reason is, you should start by defining the reasons and actually documenting and agreeing them, because then that is a starting point for then how you set your strategy to move forward with what are we going to adopt first. Is it going to be maybe a new application that you're looking to deploy into the cloud? Maybe it's just, let's get my maturity of my cloud capabilities up to speed. So maybe I'm just going to start with test and development environments and keep all my crown jewels and my existing protections I'm comfortable with on-prem. Understand the reason of going to the cloud is probably the first place to start.
Yeah, I don't think companies have a choice. I fundamentally think that if companies don't understand who's using their product or who's consuming their services and what they're actually doing with it and can't measure it, they're not going to have the information they need to form the right strategies to continue to grow. And in order to do that, there has to either be an enormous investment in infrastructure that can only be done by the largest of companies, or you need to leverage, in order to move faster, cloud-based infrastructure. So I know some companies are still thinking about this as potentially a cost or an operational play, but they better be looking at it a way to speed up what they can deliver so that they can touch those that are consuming, even in a B2B world.
Yeah, and I think the journey is, it's not a one-time shot. We have seen a lot of big clients actually not, successfully migrate to the cloud on the first shot. They have actually had iterative processes. They have, tried to go to one cloud vendor, failed there multiple times, came back and went again, tried again a year after that, right? So it's a journey at the end of the day. It's, recognizing your start is good, and it's a lot of big companies even don't, succeed at the first go. So it's always like a journey that you have to consider that.
And I guess one of the things that most companies don't realize is, they like it or not, they'll end up in the multi-cloud space. So what has ended up happening is people have chosen one particular platform and then started moving towards it and trying to put time in solutions specifically for that particular use cases. And then as soon as they start maturing, they realize that as they get into the multi-cloud environment, the same custom pieces of controls or custom tools that they might have written for that particular platform doesn't really work on the other one. And you have a maturity gap in terms of now you have multiple cloud vendors, but how do you apply consistently the same policies? So the organizations need to take a step back before they start implementing controls and think of it like, what are they going to do in the cloud? What are the controls they need? For example, if you're going to do an identity management control, you better need to make sure that you understand how identity management will work in your company, in your environment, and across multi-clouds and across it. You cannot have just a point-in-time solution that addresses one piece of it and then you leave a gap on the other side. So doing some of that initial thought process, design, and building is going to help you in the longer run rather than reacting to incidents that you start finding one after the other.
And just to add to that, as you're planning and identifying moving data to the cloud or evaluating what you currently have there, I think part of it is going back to the data itself. Do you know what data you currently have? Do you know the obligations that are associated with it? There's a lot of data residency requirements and some regulations that require contractual obligations and consent from individuals before their data is transferred outside of the country, or even just as it's shared to service providers. Obviously, Canada is not as restrictive, but there are provinces and then there are certain industries that prohibit the transferring of data outside of the country. In Europe, it's a little bit different, where if you're transferring data of European citizens, they're subject to GDPR regulation. And as a result of that, before you transfer data outside of Europe, you have to ensure that that data is being transferred to a country that has the similar level or same level of privacy protection. So you have to go back to the data that you're looking at and understand the data flows. Have you conducted a data inventory to understand what it is that you're trying to do and protect?
Isn't it fair that often when you start analyzing processes, analyzing data for something like a move to a cloud, you actually identify holes you have today and weaknesses you might have today that you weren't necessarily assessing?
And that's absolutely true. I mean, with the traditional processes, the way a data flow or work on a traditional application over here on-prem, you'll probably replicate a similar data flow for it to work on the cloud. So yeah, I mean, assessments will find out similar things, similar gaps, which will you need to remediate before you move to the cloud itself.
Yeah, so I mean, to your point of I'm going to discover potential weaknesses or vulnerabilities, and that can apply at multiple layers, right? So we're talking about security-related weaknesses and vulnerabilities, but you're going to be seeing weaknesses and vulnerabilities in performance. So, back to Maxime's discussion earlier, we like to define, if we talk about what does the vision of cloud look like, most organizations are using what we call Cloud 1.0. Cloud 1.0 is I go to a cloud provider, I put down my credit card, and I spin up servers in the cloud. Now I'm in the cloud. And that's, everybody's kind of doing that dance, right? And now I can lift and shift applications like for like, and I'm moving them off premises into the cloud. I'm in a cloud environment. So that's Cloud 1.0. We then have, customers that are now thinking about Cloud 2.0. Cloud 2.0 is, let me take my applications and move them into containerization. So many of you probably have heard of things like virtualization, Docker, right, Kubernetes. Some of you might be actually doing a lot of that stuff on-prem and scaling application virtualization. Well, now I can take that and push it into the cloud, take advantage of that shared service model or shared responsibility model, and allow my cloud provider to manage all of my Cloud 2.0 containers. And now I'm focused on applications and data again, and I can scale. Cloud 3.0 is the thinking that I have an opportunity to re-architect my applications and take advantage of serverless technology. This is where that promise of cloud and security starts to really scale up, because now I don't have to worry about infrastructure. My footprint for attack surface is reduced to almost nothing, because the way serverless technology works is you deploy an application, it doesn't actually come alive. You do microservices, you architect them together, and that service doesn't come alive until it's requested. That means the ability for an attacker to compromise that infrastructure is significantly reduced. So depending on where you are in that maturity, where you are in that vision and thinking, that ability to migrate to the cloud, discover and maybe fix, vulnerabilities and weaknesses in your process, performance, or security can actually scale up depending on which model you adopt, right?
So to your earlier question, which is, while going to the cloud, clients do end up realizing that there were certain processes that were broken to begin with, and it gets amplified when they end up going into the cloud. The example I'll give you is, we're all here, I think we're all in alignment that we need to use DevOps to be able to go to the cloud, but if you look at the DevOps fundamental principle, it is in conflict with one of the core security principles, which is segregation of duty, right? You have the same developer also doing the ops. So if there's no gap and you don't put proper authorization in place, the cloud becomes one avenue to not only do things quicker and faster, but also to make up your mistakes 1 billion times faster and costly, right? So it goes back to making sure that your processes, how do you develop code, how do you do security of code, and all of those are properly thought out, you have mature processes, and then you enable it in the cloud and not just go to the cloud and simply start making issues and mistakes quickly.
And that's a great point, and not to pick on my friends over at Microsoft, but understanding that we're not, the cloud providers themselves are fallible. A lot of organizations are like, oh, if I'm going to be more secure, am I going to be more performant in the cloud? Am I going to have more stability? But if you look at the track record, back to Abhi's point about the fact that in the cloud you scale fast, but you fail faster. Take a look at Cloudflare. Recently they deployed about a month ago. They deployed a change that hit their entire global infrastructure and took down Cloudflare. And many of you probably depended on Cloudflare. Your websites were down, you couldn't access anything. We implemented MFA for Azure, and I had a client very upset with me because you guys deployed a change and broke MFA. And our #1 security control is all administrators should be MFA. Well, now your administrators can't log into the portal, can't deploy accounts, can't get in. CIOs, CEOs are calling going, what's going on? Project managers are all upset. Well, we have to now start to plan around that fallibility. So keep that one in mind too, that they do a great job of keeping uptime, but you have to plan for failures. They are not a silver bullet. Right?
And just to add the privacy lens, part of going to the cloud and taking a look at your existing privacy program and taking a look at your communication that you have with your clients. So going back to regulations, if you look at Alberta, service providers that you're leveraging, they have to be reflected within your privacy policy. So if you're adding a cloud provider, you have to ensure that your privacy policy that's communicated to your customers specifies that you are leveraging service providers. That could be cloud service providers as well. So by leveraging a cloud provider, you'll notice different privacy implications that are missing from your program, and going back and revisiting, even creating a more data-aware culture about some of the good practices around how to handle data, what to upload, what not to upload, and what are the data restrictions around the cloud.
You know, it's interesting listening to this conversation, because when we talked about security before, usually the conversation was focused on securing the infrastructure. We just had a conversation focused on developing the applications. And I think that's one of the biggest shifts. And I think that brings organizational changes. It obviously brings skill set changes. You know, we talk a lot about the lack of we can't hire enough security people. We certainly can't necessarily hire enough people who are experts in building microservices that can potentially be secured. And there's tons of vendors out there, including us, that think we have a solution to help in some of these areas. It gets very confusing for somebody who's trying to figure out how to take the first couple steps when it just, the paradigm has shifted from securing what you're building to building what's secure. And so I just as a comment, I think it's fascinating that we're actually talking about developing software, understanding what our requirements are around data as we develop that software, as opposed to that after the fact.
But to your point, I think the question that often comes up is, can the cloud be more secure? And I'm a proponent of the view that the cloud can be more secure if it's deployed properly and configured properly. And I will say, to the credit, as you saw earlier with some of the presentations from John and earlier, that the cloud providers, have sort of re-engineered the world of compute, right? So when they came out initially with scalable compute, a lot of organizations stepped back and said, I'm not ready to use that because it's maybe not secure. I don't understand it. It's moving too fast. So they inherently, if you look at any of the major providers, security is their secret sauce. It's the service they're selling. So now they've built native control. So when you think about building a data center, you get the building, you stand up your racks, you put in your network, you put in a bunch of firewalls, you bolt on IPS, IDS, all of your security solutions get layered on in blocks. But in a cloud environment, there's native security capabilities built and integrated right into the cloud service. So if you go to Office 365 and you take a look at SecureScore, it's already giving you tools that would cost millions of dollars on-prem to replicate. To be able to pull that data into Sentinel or wherever, Backstory or whatever it is where you want to apply machine learning and scalability and AI for security, that's already built in. It's the question of, are we leveraging and architecting our solutions going forward? So to that point, I think you can build very secure solutions, and it's probably easier if you have the right level of skill, education, consultants, shameless plug, to help you on that journey, right?
And this brings a very interesting point in terms of the paradigm shift I'm looking at in my cyber risk advisory services. Back like 2 years or 3 years back before the cloud, the primary skills that we looked at in a cyber risk talent was bringing security knowledge, right? You had to be good in security knowledge. You had to have CISSPs. You need to know how security works. But it has changed in the cloud world. To be honest, the way we are looking at talent right now is you need to be good at AWS. You need to be good at Azure first. You need to know how to securely implement your applications in that particular platform. Because to Amin's point, most of the services already come with native controls built in. But unless you really know how to configure it properly, because how you configure something on AWS is not exactly same what you do on Azure. You need to know the nuances of it, right? Most of the issues happen in the cloud is not because there's not a capability that exists, but someone didn't understand how to use it or did not properly do the configuration. So what we are looking at is step one, we need people who are good at that particular platform. They understand the technology, they understand the stack, and then on top of it, they can then bring in their security knowledge on top of it. Earlier, it used to be the other way around. You are a good security guy, and then you go and start doing consulting about how do you secure stuff. But it's the other way around that we are looking at the paradigm shift.
Yeah, I think there's a intersection between engineering and like security skills, right? So I've come across a lot of people at client sites who are very strong engineers. They deploy a very good pipeline, deploys code faster, but no security controls in them, right? So finding the right talent in between, a guy with a good engineering background, software engineering background, and with security skill set as well on these technologies, it's very hard to find, to be honest. Like I don't know, we interview a lot of folks, but we don't find a lot of these good people, to be honest. So there is definitely a skill shortage in terms of, security engineers, so as to say.
So an interesting anecdote is I landed on a client a few months back, and he said, you know what, Abhi, what we have seen you big four guys doing very well is giving us good advice, right? But here, now in this new world where time is of essence, I need to go and get my workloads quickly in the cloud. What we are really looking for is individuals not only to come and give us good advice, how to do things right, but we also need people who can actually implement it and get it done. I don't have time and neither the skill set nor the resources to take your advice, go find a person who can implement it, then bring you back again to tell me whether it was done. So for the people who are looking to break into this space, that's my guidance, that it's no longer about just being good at security and knowing security skills, but it also, your technology knowledge, your basic computer and software engineering matters a lot in the cloud space these days, more so than what it used to happen earlier.
I think part of that paradigm shift is that security controls in how I'm securing these applications, I'm addressing with software the same way I'm deploying the application itself. The good news there is I can also inspect. So I create my controls and I can inspect, and I can do that all with software. It's not siloed based skills on different pieces. So it always sounds like, oh my God, how am I going to find people with these skills? But actually the whole process works better because I can, through my continuous integration, I can automate those checks as well. And I think that's critical. The controls are different, and you still need to inspect, but now you can do it in real time in a much very different way.
I think that's where the automation part kicks in, right? So I think Abhi was talking about segregation of duty, right? So I think any of us who have audited environments before, like especially DevOps environment, would have come across the challenge of segregation of duty, right? Coders deploying code in the production environment. So in a traditional environment, in on-prem, typical SDLC that you guys see, you will have that kind of segregation. It's clearly segmented out because the environment is physically different. In cloud world, and when you're doing DevOps pipelines, you wouldn't really have that. So there are misconceptions in that as well. So a lot of people talk about that developers need to have access to production environment. It's not access to production environment, it's rights to deploy in the environment, right? So if you build a pipeline in a well-mannered way, if the controls are already in place, you wouldn't have to worry. You don't have to worry about the security. It's already with every commit that you make. It will go through that automated checks. It will fail the build. It will not go through if those security controls are not there, right? So the automation piece is definitely a winner over there. And as far as control landscape goes, the controls still remain the same. It's just is implemented in a different way. You have to demonstrate that in a different way.
Yeah, and just kind of to take it back one step. So a lot of organizations aren't at that level of maturity yet to accelerate to, DevOps and pipelines, and they're still trying to figure that out on, in their own environments. Cloud's an enabler, of that capability. But the one thing to focus on if you're getting started as an organization moving to the cloud is the point of automation is great. Software-defined environments, right? Software-defined network, software-defined infrastructure as code. That is something that is very accessible. And the beauty of it is when you define it, it repeats itself typically without failure. There should be no deviations. So when you compare, we're talking about, can the cloud be more secure than my on-prem? Well, if I have individuals configuring manually, on-prem environments and devices, there's potentially a room for failure and error. When I go to the cloud and I'm starting to scale quickly and I have infrastructure as code, I set it up once and I just keep pushing buttons and it should continue to operate the exact same way. And when it deviates, I can use automation to help me fix that. So if you're talking to, trying to make the business case for, hey, we should think about starting to move to the cloud as an organization, this is a really good argument to use that, we can introduce, especially for the auditors, we can introduce, predictability and stability in our environments.
I think, just to add to that, I think it also goes back to just trying to understand the data elements that are associated with it. What exactly are you trying to protect? What we've seen and what we've done at PwC is we've trained our staff in terms of our cybersecurity, privacy, as well as our internal audit folks to understand the data implications and the practices and the controls that are associated with it. So part of what you're doing with the cloud and incorporating all these controls, you have to understand where those requirements stem. So if there is requirements around mandatory breach notification, how are you going to facilitate record keeping of that? How are you going to be able to work with your cloud provider? Do you understand why certain data can or can't move? What are just some of those basic understanding and creating the data aware culture, but also just overall making sure that your data privacy team and your information security team is very much working together continuously, that it's not siloed operations, and continuing to bridge those relationships forward.
Oh, for sure. When we were signing a contract with one of your companies, the purchasing team asked us if we store IP addresses in our software. And we said, of course. And they said, well, that's a problem. We're like, we're a DNS system. We take names and we map them to IP addresses. At some point, there's IP addresses that get stored in systems, especially if it's the point of the system. And that was 3 or 4 years ago. But still, that the level of questions and auditing in vendors too is an area that I think that brings another area of expertise that's required, so that you're not becoming overly concerned about things that you don't need to be concerned about, and slowing down progress. But are asking the right questions to the right sorts of partners.
I think there's a component of fear in that as well, right? So I think there was a client a couple of years back. They were extremely against a cloud solution that we were proposing to them at that point of time, primarily because they were of the thought that this data should not be stored on cloud. They didn't have real thoughts on where the data should be stored. However, at the same time, it was a big organization. At some part of the organization, we knew they were using some SaaS-based solution, which is actually storing endpoint data on the cloud, right? So while some part of the organization actually using it, and there's one part of the organization who thinks that storing even some metadata of what's information on cloud, it's not safe, right? So I think there's a component of fear and the component of not understanding what exactly the impact is. It goes to education as well of your vendors.
Yeah. So to Maria's point about making sure you know your data, privacy is going to become a major driver in terms of the strategy that you may need to adopt. So we had this kind of discussion a little bit earlier. Let's just take the banks, right? A few of you are from the banks, I think. OSFI, right? OSFI's guidance on their 10B is basically that when you're dealing with an outsourced relationship, you need to have an exit plan. Now think about that. So when I think back in 2012, there was some guidance that was released that said we understand a lot of these banks are going to be going to outsourced relationships with cloud providers. And the guidance is basically, hey, it's still an outsourced provider. Third-party risk management is still your responsibility. Meeting certain tenants, including contingency planning. So now what we're hearing is, guidance, and I'm not speaking for OSFI, but just sort of what we're hearing in the market is that, back to Abby's point about multi-cloud. Your strategy you may be forced to use a particular provider because they offer data residency capabilities to manage your privacy requirements. You may be forced into a multi-cloud model in order to be compliant with some regulation, like something that may come out of OSFI down the line that says you can't just put all your eggs in the AWS basket. You have to spread them around, because if something happens to some cloud provider you chose to use, there needs to be a plan. So you got to be thinking about a lot of this now in terms of, okay, if we're going to start to architect and move into the cloud, the question is which cloud or which clouds, and what is your plan for potentially addressing multi-cloud? And it's going to come quickly, right? Because as soon as, and especially as you see all these breaches are happening, privacy is now just up in the air. Some privacy commissioner is going to step up one day and say, here's the rules that you need to follow. And it's going to force you to take certain positions, right?
So just to add to those rules that you now have to follow, so if we look at Europe, GDPR has created very substantial privacy regulations, which has created, like, taken the whole world by storm, and all the laws that are now popping up in the US. So what's interesting about GDPR is it has certain requirements for data controllers as well as data processors. So data processors, who are now your cloud service providers, have certain very strong requirements. Some of them include making sure that they're providing adequate security and technical measures to protect all the data. They're making sure that anytime they're looking to use a third-party provider to process any of those activities, that you as a client have the right to consent or decline those obligations, also doing certain risk assessments, and in addition, that those service providers are also helping you with mandatory breach obligations. Part of Canada now has mandatory breach notification through PIPEDA, and as a result of that, there's certain obligations, including mandatory record keeping for 2 years from the point of when you identify a breach. But part of that is trying to understand who is going to help to keep those records. Is it going to be the responsibility of you, the client, or is it going to be the responsibility of the cloud service provider? And how is that relationship going to be divvied? And also, if you're looking at mandatory notification, if that's the case, you have to do something called a real risk assessment to identify if there is a risk of harm to affected individual. In order to do that, you need access to certain records. So how are you going to be working with a cloud service provider? And then notifying the privacy commissioner. There's certain reporting that you have to do. How did the breach occur? What was impacted? What things were done to remediate? If there's certain criminal information, or there's certain records that cannot be released by the cloud provider, then there might be an issue there. But part of that should be negotiated and should be revisited regularly as all these regulations are popping up, not just what is nice to have, but what is becoming mandatory. And a lot of companies are now becoming like the spotlight child of how they should or should not use data, Facebook, for example. And so.
Right.
So I have this philosophy called trust but validate. And the reason behind it is, if you go and ask, and it's especially prevalent in the SaaS space, when a cloud provider goes and says to you that I have a local Canadian instance of my particular SaaS service. If, say, for example, you have something like Slack that gives you an ability to not only use messaging, but also store files and allows you to share files and so on. If you start looking under the covers, you will soon realize that not all the services are hosted in Canada. Right? So trust, but do your own due diligence, validate that you're buying something, because as soon as you start peeling under the covers, you might realize that although your instant messaging solution might be hosted in Canada, the underlying services that it is utilizing, the data is being stored in some other country, right? So at the end of the day, you being the client, the accountability rests with you, right? So trust your service provider, but do enough due diligence and validate that you're actually getting what you're asking.
Yeah, get as far as zero trust and not trusting at all. Which leads me to another topic just around segmentation in general. From my perspective, in this move to the cloud, segmentation, which is very difficult to do at any level other than the network level with firewalls internally, and yes, lots of vendors have great solutions in that space. In the cloud, microsegmentation sort of comes by default. Nothing can speak to anything unless I've specifically allowed that thing to speak to that thing. And that creates a great palette to build something that is secure by design, because I can then control that policy. And I think panacea is some idea of policy married to compute, married to identity, that is consistent across data center, branches, campuses, clouds, which becomes very, very difficult with all the different technology solutions out there without trying to do some sort of least common denominator. But the cloud gives us that opportunity at least to segment appropriately if we do it correctly.
Well, it's back to what John demoed, right? So service policies, or we call in the AWS word, service control policies, SCP, or the Azure policy, the genesis of that is to your point. Can I apply a consistent level of protection to my cloud environment and make sure it's consistent every single time? So if a developer deploys something to an environment, it has to go into this location. If they deploy some files or some storage, it has to be encrypted. That's all enforceable. It's all automation. It's all built in. The issue is this: you have to go turn it on, and you have to enforce it, and it has to make sense in your world. A lot of organizations, that's where they don't know about it, or these are just things that have just recently come out. But I think the cloud providers are recognizing that in order to speed adoption, we have to make it easy and secure. So you're going to see these kinds of things happen across multiple organizations. But you think about that whole idea of, can I be more secure? Well, imagine being able to push one button in your on-prem environment and apply encryption to everything. Like that would be, we'd all be partying right now if we could do that. Can't do it on-prem necessarily without a lot of heavy lifting, but in this cloud environment, it's automatic, right?
Yeah, in a consistent way to make sure that nobody has the keys until they need them, and that's audited, and they only have access to them when they need them. And these
Microsoft just released a capability. I'm plugging Microsoft today, I don't know why. But they released that capability, right? So a really interesting paradigm, privileged identity management. Gives you the ability, so when we talk about good practice, right? We say, create a network bastion layer. So before I go into my private cloud environment, I have to hit, via VPN or via, some dedicated link, a machine. And I'm going to get on that machine. It's going to be super secure. And then from there, I'm going to go into my cloud. So I'm insulating my internal cloud from the public, from the internet is really that model, right? So we call that the bastion host model. For years, like this was a tenet of architecture, network security. And just in the last couple of months, out to the forefront is now this just-in-time privileged identity access, meaning my administrators don't have to have standing administrator access, which can get attacked, which can get compromised. I can, just in time, request access, have it approved, get access for a short period of time, have it revoked. My threat, and attack vectors are now reduced. I can get access to specific virtual machines for a period of time directly without having to go through a bastion, without having to expose, all on demand. These are all the things that are coming out that have just recently been released in like months ago. So being able to keep up and knowing like I can re-architect and reduce and simplify my entire infrastructure and management, and I'm a believer that the simpler the architecture, the more secure the architecture. There's a lot of opportunities coming from the cloud because of that.
And if you architect it right, you can actually create VMs without requirement of any users to go in and interact with them, right? So depending on how you're kind of architecting the entire thing, you can have like passwordless VMs, or even kind of only have service account access to the VM machines only. And if required, there can be an auditable track of who requires what kind of access and be given that kind of access during that kind of thing.
Do we want to take some questions from the audience?
I would say one definitely thing is data science, for sure. So if you already have a background in security, if you have a traditional background, data science has applications in a long-term scale as well. So definitely one of the things to go for, apart from cloud operations, of course.
Yeah. So I think, I take a strategic and architectural view. I think understanding risk and connecting that back to my original point, purposeful architecture and move to the cloud. If you're going to be a good security practitioner or a good cloud security practitioner, you have to be able to understand what is the organization's risk profile, and then how do I mitigate that with the available capabilities in the cloud. So there's security operations component, there's architecture, and there's a risk management piece. If we just focus on data and systems and shiny buttons, we're going to fail. So I find, I like to see folks who understand how to articulate and capture risk and then translate that to a solution in the cloud. That's success.
And as you know, my point, right, which is I've been in the space where we have been good at architecting, designing, and telling people what's the right thing and what needs to be done. But where we end up failing is people who do not understand how to do it in AWS. So there needs to be someone who is able to take the architecture and the design that has been already mandated by your organization and know the platform well enough that they can actually apply it to the degree that it's rightly configured. So for me, it would be before you get to the security level, if you're starting out your career from on-premise to the cloud, get to know what you're doing pretty well, and then you can learn security or take the security architecture and the design that has been done by the experts and apply it properly.
And everybody should become a software developer.
Yes. Yeah.
And a influencer, because these teams haven't worked close enough together historically. And for this to work, we need the skill sets, people with deep security backgrounds, people who are building new applications to start designing and architecting and working together. And that requires some sort of influence and collaboration that didn't necessarily happened before. There's headbutting, there's tension, there's different groups and different management. There's, so it's for sure those two things. Maria?
I would just add on the points that were made earlier. I think taking a risk management look is important. Taking a look at how your role is going to impact the overall business. What is the risk associated to the business? And I'm not only talking about the risk of losing your clients, but you also have to take into account potential class actions, litigations, your reputational risk, which is sometimes substantially more challenging. And I would also try to, just to add to your point, try to incorporate privacy into the design. So as you are incorporating security and all those requirements, also work to incorporate privacy. Those two teams are still very separate, and this is a gap we're really trying to bridge and really try to pull together, because we're all doing and we're all working to protect the same product, essentially data, but we all have slightly different avenues. So the more we understand how we work, not specifically to the detail, but the overall framework, we'll be able to better protect the organization.
Thank you very much. And I'm just going to broaden the questions a bit. It's I'm migrating workloads, I'm migrating applications, I'm moving something from on-premise, I might be redeveloping, and I might just be virtualizing it and moving it. How does one acquire the skills and familiarity necessary to either advise others to do it or simply to do it? How do I onboard these skills as a person or organizationally?
So just to your point, right? So there are courses available for this, right? So online you can have tons of tutorials for that. One thing that's really important is your hands-on skills for this, right? So getting hands-on onto the certain solutions. There are things like Linux Academy or A Cloud Guru. You can go there. You can actually have hands-on AWS sessions as you're going through the course content. So definitely getting some hands-on skills from these kind of sites, that kind of helps out.
I'm of the opinion you start with what you're comfortable. Build on the foundation you already have. So if you're in the world of Windows already on-prem, then maybe a migration, being able to move into Azure is kind of more familiar to you because you'll already have some of the basics. You'll understand some of the terminology. You'll understand how the world of Windows and PowerShell and Cloud Shell works. If you're a Linux kind of focused individual, then maybe you might find, you can still do Microsoft and things like that in an AWS world, but it tends to be more prevalent towards Linux environments and workloads. And you can do them in either area, but the premise is leverage the foundational knowledge you have and then align yourself to develop those, those operational and architecture skills.
But like let's say AWS or Microsoft, they come up with new features every day.
Every hour, yeah.
Yeah. So how are you acquiring them and implementing them in production?
Yeah, so how are we keeping up? So like, for example, it's a lot of research, right? Before I came here, I made sure that I went and I took a look at what are some of the latest things that are coming out that I could speak to you guys about. I've got clients that we're advising in real time on security assessments at very large levels. And being able to know that, hey, Microsoft just released this new feature. They've got mailing lists, they've got blogs, I'm on Twitter. Twitter is like your #1 fan. Follow all of the cloud folks, follow me, follow these guys. You'll learn about new announcements, new capabilities. I just came back from Black Hat and DEF CON in Vegas. Learned a ton of brand new stuff straight from the horse's mouth about what's coming out. What are some of the trends? How are others, learn from others, right? How are others solving this problem? I'm sure you guys kind of have that same approach. It's all about just keep learning.
Yeah, as an individual going up a learning curve, the good news is most of these cloud vendors provide free tiers. There's tons of information online, and I don't care what you read or what courses you go to, you don't really understand the stuff until you get your hands on it, and so get dirty. It's free.
And to add to your question, it's even more challenging in the security space, right? If you can't understand what is being released, what the features are, what the native capabilities are, it becomes even difficult. How do you secure it? Because people want to utilize the next shiny thing that is being rolled out. And at Deloitte, we have taken a conscious decision. That's the reason why we have segregated our cloud security practice. Like, don't be a master of all, focus on one thing. If you're an AWS expert, you're an AWS expert with deep security skills in it. If you're a GCP guy, be it. It's not like we don't want people to be, but it takes time, it takes effort to build your skills and be a master and be current on a certain platform.
Yeah, I think I'm on 13 years.
Yeah.
Thank you. There's another question.
Yes.
Yeah.
My name is. You want to go ahead or?
Go ahead. I can't see who's asking the
Microphone?
question.
Right here.
Hi.
Okay, there you
Got
go.
the-
Yeah, that was weird.
My name is Swapnil. My question to you is very new, and you just mentioned it, and we're kind of going over it as a group, and we're thinking about just what kind of the space should be looking like. So in terms of PAM, privileged access management, obviously if you're into just-time inventory, sorry, that's a whole term, just-time password release to admins and all that. In terms of active session management of the admin itself, of what's being done, what do you think of the space of AI versus actual humans observing the session itself? Because if it's so mission critical and high cost of switching, where do you think that space kind of, what's the percentage of computers looking at it versus actual human beings looking at it, right?
So to your point around automation and leveraging compute. So I'm actually, so I've spent 13 years doing cybersecurity investigations cloud. I'm actually right now doing a postgraduate engineering degree at Columbia Engineering in artificial intelligence and machine learning. And my whole focus is exactly to your question. You think about the amount of data that we create on a daily basis, on an hourly basis. How many of you guys just in this one session took a photo, at least one photo of the screen or any of this session today? Anybody take one picture? Okay, 5 megabytes high resolution for each one of you. Think about the amount of data we created in minutes, right? So because of the speed and scalability of cloud, you can expect that the amount of data we're going to create, the amount of sensors we're going to deploy, the amount of telemetry that the cloud providers themselves, just to Microsoft's point on Sentinel, give us all of the data you have. Microsoft, Google will say the same thing. Give us all the data you have. We will analyze it using machine learning and AI. That is the future. And so one of the other additional learning things that you should become familiar with is how are we going to apply machine learning and AI to solving cybersecurity problems? Because the amount of data, a regular analyst is not going to be able to do that, at scale. But at the same time, I also believe that the quality that the human mind is capable of analyzing and discerning and differentiating will not be done by a computer. And so the idea is, can I leverage that technology to scale down what I need to focus on using ML and AI, and then have a human go and look at it and go, that's good, that's bad. That's sort of my thesis and what I'm doing for my engineering component.
Which makes a lot of sense. Starting with a set of controls that can be monitored.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I'm not just going to say, leave it to AI or ML. I need to, and by the way, when it comes to the infrastructure running on the cloud, unless what you're deploying is like VDI or something, better nobody can log into it at all. Let them log into access to monitor, let them access to understand operations and performance, but build compute that doesn't require anybody to log directly into it, because once you do that, you're opening some level of Pandora's box, and it's pretty easy to build stateless services that don't require humans to log in to understanding how they're behaving. It needs to be engineered in, which creates yet more data. But it needs to be engineered in so I understand how this stuff is being used, and I can monitor it without having to log in and look at log files, or there should be no ability to log in.
And you'll find one of the areas, what you're talking about is user behavior analytics, right? That's actually kind of the up and coming area. It leverages machine learning. So a lot of the cloud providers are now giving you that automation. So when we talked about, risky sign-ins, well, what is that really doing? It's looking at you logged in from this location in Canada, 15 minutes ago, and now all of a sudden we're seeing logins coming from, Africa. Right? So there's only two options there. Either your account's been hacked, or you went through a VPN, or you time traveled. Three options, right? So they can bubble up those risky sign-ins and leverage automation. So they can say, okay, fine. So if you're going to log in from that location, I'm going to force you to re-authenticate your identity. So now that, back to your point around sessions and existing sessions, you have to provide MFA, right? Multi-factor authentication before I'm going to let you access this location. And and if you fail, then alerts are going off. So, but all of that whole technology is being enabled by machine learning, right?
Right. It's the value, not the machine learning on its own. And I think
Right.
a lot of vendors push, hey, we're better because we're ML, versus we're better because we, in a measurable way, can solve these very real risks, mitigate these very real risks you have, or solve these problems. We can add value. And then let's talk about how we do it. And I think that's the proof in the pudding. I think we are out of time. I want to thank you all.
Thank you.
And hopefully that was enjoyable. Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
So
So actually, before you go,
Yeah.
what's your last recommendation to the audience?
Well, in my case, I think if you synthesize the whole security issue, I would focus on two things. The identity problem, because identity is the new perimeter, which is who is accessing it, what it is doing it, and so on. The other is the data. What's the data you're putting in the cloud? What's the risk of it? And your worst case scenario, if you end up losing it, what's going to happen with that? So if you're able to answer even these two questions, you're at a significantly above maturity level and trying to understand what controls I need to put in before going through all the other rest of the stuff.
I think from the people standpoint, learning, to come into cloud operations or cloud skill set itself, one thing definitely I would suggest is learn to code. This world runs on infrastructure as a code. There are a lot of, you can do a lot of things with the code itself. Even not learn to write code, but learn to read the code at least, right? So definitely learn those things, those skill sets.
So my parting thoughts for you are going to be what I started with. Be purposeful about your use of the cloud. Understand why you're using the cloud and move towards that direction. That's number one. Number two is don't be afraid of the cloud. It's here to stay. It's not going anywhere. It's only getting better. And so the earlier you can get up to speed with understanding technologies, we take like a walk before you run model, right? If you're not ready to go to, put production workloads in the cloud, put some developer, capabilities in the cloud. Start to get familiar with the different concepts, because the concepts are all the same. The building blocks are the same. It's really at the end of the day scale, right? That you're gonna, as you develop maturity, you accelerate, you scale out. But the same building blocks, whether you launch one virtual machine or you launch 100, they're the same.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So I think I'm going back to what I've been saying most of the evening. Know your data. I think it's important. Just coming from the privacy lens, I think it's important to understand what are your obligations, keeping aware of what's going on in the market, trying to understand that it's important what you're doing and how it impacts the organization, looking at the overall risk, not just the breach itself, but looking at what is the reputational risk to the organization that you're dealing with. And one of the biggest things that I would suggest is that just because you're leveraging a third-party provider, whether it's a cloud or another vendor, your accountability does not go with that vendor. It's up to you to be accountable, but they are assisting you with delivering your services. And then, sorry, one more thing I would suggest is trying to integrate more privacy and security, making sure those two teams are really working together. And I think that's really, really important, and it's really helping us to drive the same message.
Yeah, the collaboration is critical. Just one point on that, though. It's also, you hear all this stuff, whether it's privacy, whether it's data security, identity, whatever it is, and you get a sense that everybody needs to know everything, which isn't true at all. Architecting this well allows people to do their job well, and this other stuff comes for free. I'm pushing data through to that data store. I don't need to know about cryptography, because the way we've architected and the way we're onboarding our application requires that things are encrypted, and there's nothing more I need to do about it because I'm running in this zone that gives me access to these keys, and the cloud's actually providing that for me. There's not a line of code I wrote to encrypt or decrypt data. So architected correctly, you can still have separation of expertise that builds together a system that's way more secure, even though you go through all these different areas and it sounds like there's a ton of skills that everybody needs to acquire. But it all needs to come from a policy that builds in all of these different pieces.
So I'd like to close this with, first of all, thanking Brian for getting all the Big Four and Andrew here.
I answered that, yes.
And the other thing is, all the Big Four are hiring in this growing space, so reach out to any of us if you're interested in pursuing a career in this space. Thank you.
Thank you very much.